Hi, everybody. Welcome to Making the Grade on this Tuesday after Memorial Day. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. We are live on Facebook right now to bring you the very latest in education news. And joining me, as he always does so faithfully, Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News, idahoednews.org. You guys are continuing, Kevin, to post a massive amount of work considering the situation.
Well, there's just thank you, but there's just a massive amount of news happening. So we're trying to stay on top of it as best we can.
Okay, so as schools are winding down, K through 12, and also the university systems, for the unprecedented school year that we've had, let's look ahead to schools in the fall. So first of all, Governor Brad Little, during an AARP conference last week, started to talk a little tiny bit about what he would see as expectations for fall for K through 12. So let's talk a little bit about that. And then I also know that you're working on a story about what happens at Boise State in the fall.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, I think one question parents have, as I'm a West Ada school district parent, and I know that I've already been surveyed about my next fall for the kids, but what does school look like for fall? Will our kids be tested for coronavirus before they head back?
The short answer that we heard from the governor last week is no. There's not going to be mass testing of every student that comes into the public school system, and we're talking about 300,000 students. So that's not going to happen. Now, how much testing may take place? How do you try to target that kind of testing? I mean, that's part of a bigger question that the state is trying to figure out. I mean, just on Friday, the governor's office and state health officials laid out their plans to try to ramp up testing. We know Idaho has struggled to try to get more testing in place for adults and for kids. This is a universal issue in the state. Idaho's per capita testing at or near the bottom nationally. So probably not surprising that the governor is saying, no, we're not going to be able to test every kid.
He was saying, though, that they are working closely with the State Department of Education to try and come up with some guidelines for districts, correct? Because there has to be, even though each school district is obviously very different in a state like ours, how many kids they deal with, how many people are inside their buildings, how many buildings they have. You know, some are very rural schools, only may have one or two buildings that they're dealing with. But are there going to be some kind of state guidelines for the districts about what to expect?
I think what you're going to probably see now in the next few weeks is where does the State Board of Education come down in terms of guidelines for the fall. State Board had worked on guidelines to try to allow for some reopenings and really limited the amount of school reopenings that could take place to really small groups of kids. That's what the State Board did for the spring. So what the board is working on now is more of a plan long-term for the fall.
Will the Department of Education, State Superintendent, have anything to do with that?
Oh, sure. I think that, we'll get a better sense here in the next few weeks of where state officials want to go in terms of what a reopening plan looks like. I think everybody is in agreement that they want to try to get the schools reopened, but what does that look like? And what does it look like heading into the fall and winter if there's a second wave of coronavirus?
And how do the districts deal with that? The governor talked about his major priority being, of course, that kids can go back to school. And I want to mention we are live on Facebook with Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. We are taking your comments as they come in. So if you have some thoughts about what you would like to see in terms of if you're a parent or an educator, with what you would like to see in your personal district, because obviously this is on a case-by-case basis, but things like, do you think kids should have to wear masks? Do you think there should be temperature checks before kids enter a building? Some of those precautions, how many kids should be in a building when we're talking about social distancing? We'd love to hear your thoughts and comments as we move through this discussion today right here on Making the Grade. Kevin, what about for the university systems? They've already decided, Boise State coming out with a few thoughts about what the fall will look like for kids heading back to the Boise State campus.
Right, so we had guidelines come out on Friday, both from Boise State University and the University of Idaho, both kind of laid out their plans or their hopes for reopening campuses in the fall. And both Boise State and the University of Idaho want to reopen. They want to get the students back on campus, but it's going to be a different look. Things are going to be different in terms of how are classes conducted? Boise State is talking about sort of a combination of face-to-face classes, online classes, hybrid classes that combine a little bit of both. One of the big changes that Boise State is talking about, and again, talking about the potential for a second wave of coronavirus here, Boise State's plan is to reopen on August 24th, which was their regularly scheduled date to begin fall semester. But then after Thanksgiving break, everything would move online. The final 3 weeks of the semester would be conducted online. So students go home for Thanksgiving break and they don't come back presumably until the spring semester. The idea is to have a little bit of control over the potential of students or staff coming back from Thanksgiving break after having traveled, maybe coming back exposed to coronavirus and potentially spreading coronavirus on campus. So that's one of the big changes that Boise State is talking about going into the fall.
Did they mention the leadership at Boise State as they were discussing some of this, Kevin, looking at what other schools around the country are doing? Or are they seeing Idaho as being a very isolated situation because of our rural nature, even at Boise State? I mean, what's going on in California is certainly not what's happening here in Idaho.
I don't think any of this happens in a vacuum, Michelle. I mean, you talked about the idea of Thanksgiving, kind of going to a remote model after Thanksgiving. I suspect we're going to see that from other universities around the country. I know that other universities have talked about ramping up the beginning of the fall semester, moving it up a couple of weeks so that you can end the fall semester at Thanksgiving. That's not the approach Boise State is taking. And instead, it's the regular schedule, but a different delivery model heading into the final couple of weeks of the fall semester.
Kevin, let me bring up a few comments here as we've been getting them in. Just want to kind of stream through these a little bit, let you know that we are listening and hearing what you're saying as we've engaged you in this conversation. Don saying, I have so many parents that are very concerned about social distancing. Has anyone thought about the effect on this on our children? Kids need hugs. Social distancing with little ones is certainly difficult. And then Kathy says, I would like schools to be back open with no restrictions.
I don't know if that's where the state board or the State Department of Education is going to come down. I think, we'll have to see what happens in the next couple of months and what is happening with the pandemic, across the state and nationally. But at this point, what is being talked about, what was talked about for reopening in the spring, which I anticipate is going to be the starting point for what's talked about for reopening in the fall, I've got to think that schools are going to look different. I have to think that the public schools are going to look different, and certainly higher education is planning to look different.
Well, work is continuing to look different, as you can see.
Right.
Allison saying we need distancing, good ventilation, probably masks. How about hybrid classes, a choice to log on to the classroom virtually or attend it in person? It's going to be interesting with a comment like this, especially with rolling closures, Kevin, that schools may need to adapt and be able to do a number of different models. And really, thank goodness that we have the technology we do today.
That we have the technology, and also at this point, you have a little bit of time. State board, State Department of Education, and local educators can use this summer to look at what they had to do to get through the spring, and to look at what they might need to do if the situation changes, if the situation worsens sometime in the fall or sometime in the winter. You have at least a little bit more time to plan ahead, to take a breath, to think about what your options are and what you would do under a worst case scenario, or a worsening scenario, maybe not worst case, but if you have an outbreak, and if it's a localized outbreak or if it's more of a statewide situation.
Well, and this will be interesting too, I think, Kevin, to watch this. We're getting comments in from Kathy and now from Tom, both of them here really talking about allowing parents to have control and letting parents make that decision. As we all know, as parents who have kids in school districts, there have been obviously things in place that make sure kids are going to school. It's going to be interesting to see how the state board handles how many days kids are allowed to be out of school now and what exceptions happen, because this isn't just a cut and dry numbers game anymore about truancy or not truant.
Yeah, well, what kind of absentee policies go into effect in the fall? That's going to be very interesting to watch, and it's going to be something that I know parents are going to be very interested in. What does that look like? What options do parents have to put their own kids' protection first and foremost, which I think everybody wants. I mean, I don't think anybody wants kids to be put at risk here. But what does that look like in terms of policy, in terms of giving parents the ability to react to what they're seeing, to react to how their kids are feeling, and try to be proactive about this. So I don't know what this is all going to look like, but I think the questions that we're seeing from viewers, those are the very questions that I'm sure the state board is going to be looking at very closely, what the State Department of Education is going to look at, what local educators are going to look at. So I think we're hitting on the questions that I know are going to be discussed a lot in the weeks and months to come. And I think, parents, this is an opportunity to, if you have concerns, questions, to reach out to your local educators and let them know what's on your mind.
Well, and some of those things where we don't even necessarily think about it. Here's a comment from Logan that kids obviously need a safe zone. And we have done a number of stories at Idaho News 6 about how kids, and you too, Kevin, at Idaho Education News, kids falling through the cracks who desperately need school to make sure that they are staying safe and staying healthy. And we're not just talking about school lunches. Unfortunately, we could be talking about abuse situations here. So they need that safe zone. And, Logan also brings up a good point too, kids with disabilities, and how do you reach in our Constitution for our state government? It declares that every child will have an equal education, and that's equal to their ability. And that is going to have to be a whole new way of figuring this thing out.
Again, we know that the achievement gaps that we already see in the school system, those are going to be widened when kids return in the fall. We know that this is going to affect kids differently, especially kids with special needs. So how schools try to help those students bridge that gap or narrow that gap, get reacquainted to the structure of being back in school. That's going to be a really big challenge for teachers and for parents going forward.
Travis is saying, especially kids with disabilities really struggling at home and with video chats. Could understand that. We struggle with that just as adults, and they need that live interaction. So how this all looks is certainly uncertain. We're going to continue to take your comments and thoughts here on Facebook as we're live with Kevin Richert from Idaho Ed News. And go to idahoednews.org. You're seeing some of his stories and the stories that his colleagues are doing pop up as we're having this conversation here. A couple other topics I do want to get to, though, and we'd love to get your comments on these as we're here in Making the Grade. Real quickly, Kevin, you guys wrote a piece, and I thought this was interesting. You and I had talked over the last couple of weeks about the CARES Act and how much money is coming to schools through the federal government. Well, BYU Idaho was set to take in $18 million, half of which needed to be able to go to students to help with student aid directly, and they've refused the money. How come?
It was really kind of interesting, and I'm not really sure the how come is all that clear, except that BYU Idaho, along with other colleges and universities owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, BYU's main campus in Provo, Utah, their campus in Hawaii, all of the BYU schools are turning down this federal coronavirus aid. And what BYU Idaho is saying, and this is a story that our friends at East Idaho News broke on Thursday, what BYU Idaho said in its email to students is that they feel like they can provide the student aid without having to accept the federal dollars. So it was an interesting development only because BYU Idaho stood to receive such a sizable chunk of federal funding. Like you said, $18 million. That is more than any of the state-run institutions would have received. I think Boise State is in line to and is receiving and is going to spend about $11 million. BYU Idaho, again, $18 million was what they were projected to receive. And yes, at least half of that was earmarked for direct student aid to help students overcome financial hardship as a result of the coronavirus outbreak.
Well, and Kevin, remind people that the number that was given to each individual school, because if people haven't heard this, I think they'd be shocked to know that BYU Idaho was going to get $18 million, where Boise State was only going to see $11 million. What was the formula for that?
It was a formula based on student demographics, and it was based largely on how many students at a college or university are eligible for federal Pell Grants. Those are the federal grants that go to low-income students. So the more Pell Grant students you have, the larger share, the larger chunk of federal money you would receive. The idea being to help schools that have more students who are really suffering a financial hardship as a result of the coronavirus.
Well, let's stay on the topic of money, shall we? Because I thought a really fascinating story, and I know this gets in the weeds for some people who aren't in the education field, but the simple way to put it is that contract negotiations for teachers happen during the summer.
Right.
And
happen right now. It's starting right
we are
now.
in uncertain times for school districts who do not know literally how much money necessarily they're even dealing with teacher contracts, what teachers can make, especially with the state looking to cut possibly $100 million out of the K through 12 education budget. This is an uncertain time for negotiators, correct, Kev?
Yeah, it really is. And the reason is, as you mentioned, we know that the state is going to have to institute some sort of budget cuts, and those are going to affect K-12. And the number that you're talking about, the $99 million, that anticipates a 5% cut in state funding. It anticipates a similar reduction in tax revenues coming in. We don't really know what the tax revenue picture is going to be on July 1st. So the numbers are a little bit sketchy, but school districts, as they go to the bargaining table, know that it's going to be tight. They know that they don't have as much money coming in as they might have expected just a few months ago. And that affects teacher salaries and it affects teacher benefits first and foremost, because that's the largest expense a school district faces. The human resources here, hiring, keeping teachers on staff, providing them benefits. That's the largest expense any school district faces.
I want to continue to bring in comments just as we're listening to you, as everybody out there on Facebook land, as we continue to talk about all these other topics. Probably the one thing near and dear to most people's hearts, Kevin, as you can imagine, is that what are parents going to be dealing with come this fall? And Shannon was saying, one of my concerns is communication wouldn't get to parents as far as a plan in a reasonable amount of time to make parents have changes in advance. And I can certainly understand the whiplash effect that all parents went through when schools just closed down within a week, and the whiplash effect that it had on school districts. And that is a point, as we go back to that discussion, that it's going to take a lot of communication effort to figure out how this looks going into fall and beyond.
Exactly. And again, you would hope that local schools as well as state education officials, now they have a summer to start to think about how this might look in the fall, and to start to draw out some scenarios. Okay, if this happens with coronavirus, how would we respond locally? If this happens, how do we respond locally? I mean, this unfolded so quickly in March, and schools had to respond so quickly. Yeah, at least going into the new school year, you have the advantage, if you want to call it an advantage, to at least be able to take a breath, to at least be able to take a step back. And you have the experience from the spring to build on. And it's been a trying experience. I understand that. But at least you can look at it and say, okay, we know this, we want to do differently. We know that this maybe has some potential. So, you have some experience and you have some time. And those are two things that we didn't have in the spring.
True. We had none of that.
It was boom, you've got to do this, and you have to do this really quickly. And, you've got to turn on the dime within a matter of days. really tough to do in any sector. Education, business, journalism, we all had to change very quickly, but education, really had to change quickly, and the stakes are, so incredibly high when you're talking about, changing a public school system for 300,000 kids in a heartbeat.
It's a massive job.
Yes.
They have their summer schools cut out for them, all of the state
Yes.
leaders trying to figure this out. Before I let you go, Kevin, a story that we have been following now for weeks, but there have been some interesting developments in case people missed them on Friday when this really became kind of news. The state superintendent, Sherry Ibarra, of course, we've been reporting at Idaho News 6 that she has filed a lawsuit against the State Board of Education, of which she is a member,
Right.
and the legislature in general, over the taking of 18 positions, I believe it is, from her department, IT positions, and putting them onto the State Board of Education. That also takes away about $2.7 million from the State Department of Education budget and gives it over to the State Board of Education. This lawsuit is now in the hands of the Idaho Supreme Court. And what's been interesting is how well you have been following all of the filings that have happened. And Fridays, once again, kind of gave a little insight into the fact that this literally is, in your words, a turf war.
It really is. And so to explain what was filed on Friday and to sort of, put it into context. So the lawsuit was filed in late April against the legislature and against the state board. So what we had a week ago Friday, and what we wrote about a week ago Friday, was the response from the defendants, the state board, the legislature, their attorneys. What we then had this Friday afternoon, the Friday afternoon right before the holiday weekend, was the response to the response, and that comes from David Leroy, State Superintendent Sherry Ibarra's attorney. What I found most interesting in these filings, the constitutional argument that Leroy is making on Ibarra's behalf really didn't change all that much. We would have expected that it would. But what I found really interesting as you dig into the supporting documents, as you dig into the exhibits that were filed on Friday, State Superintendent Ibarra and her State House liaison, Marilyn Whitney, both filed these detailed chronologies of their conversations with legislators during the session. And it's just their accounts of their conversations with the legislature. So it's one side of the story inherently. But wow, they are talking about not just that this was a retaliatory measure by legislators, but they're saying legislators really want to get rid of this elected position and want to turn the state superintendent into an appointed position, as is the case in many other states. But
I was going to say, Kevin, let me stop you right there, because you're right. Over half of the states do not have this as an elected position. The state superintendent, that position who runs the department, is actually appointed by the governor.
Idaho is in the minority on this because most states do have an appointed state superintendent. But our elected state superintendent is, that is part of the Constitution. So to change that to an appointed position is a pretty heavy lift. Politically, you have to get 2/3 support in both houses to get a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot, and then voters have to say yes. So it's not an easy proposition to get rid of an elected position like this and turn it into an appointed position. But the fact that this is something that Superintendent Ibarra is arguing in her defense here and in her push to maintain these positions is that she feels like her position as an elected state superintendent is under attack. This has become a very volatile lawsuit, and regardless of the outcome, I think there's going to be some bitterness. There's going to be some residual resentment. This has been, I've called it a scorched earth lawsuit, and it feels like with every development, with every new filing, it feels even more so.
Well, in a time when education is so up in the air, it's going to see interesting to see what political ramifications something like this has, not only inside the State House itself and in the working bodies of the governor's office with the State Department of Education, but ramifications out to the public too, as education is in the spotlight because we are all now forced to be teachers in some way or another.
Right, and we've seen that feedback already. Whenever I write about this lawsuit, one of the threads that always seems to come through in the comments is, why are we doing this? Why are we having this lawsuit when we're already having to cut education? Why are we spending money on lawyers? Why are we going to the courts on this? Obviously, Superintendent Ibarra's argument and David Leroy's argument on her behalf is this is an important constitutional issue that we can't afford to set aside. But I think the optics for readers and for taxpayers is we are embroiled in a lawsuit, agency versus agency, state official versus state official, all being paid for with taxpayer dollars. All the legal fees are coming from taxpayers. That's a hard look. The optics of it are definitely challenging for Superintendent Ibarra. There's no getting around that.
Well, we can wrap that discussion up because it won't be wrapped up until the Supreme Court of Idaho hears the cases via our lovely Zoom life now that we all have. And that happens.
You're right. Next step, June 5th, the Supreme Court will hold oral arguments, as you say, via Zoom. They'll hear oral arguments in this case. No clear timeline on when the court will act, except that I would anticipate them acting fairly quickly, simply because the Supreme Court has put this thing on a fast track. The shift of positions, the shift of dollars is scheduled to go into effect on July 1st. So I think the state Supreme Court is definitely feeling they definitely see the importance of making a decision, handing down a ruling before this goes too much further.
Kevin,
I think anticipate some decision fairly quickly after the June 5th hearing.
Let me bring in a couple more comments for you, just because these have continued to come in. We really appreciate all of you engaging with us right here on Making the Grade on Facebook. Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News joining me as always. This one really caught my eye. Christine is saying, I'm a grandparent raising my grandsons. They're already behind because I have no idea what I'm doing. Christine, we're feeling for you, no matter who you are and what age you are. She says, I don't understand computers and they need face-to-face teaching. So that one just really caught my eye. And then this one from Jana, I'd like to bring in too, which Jana, we appreciate that you've liked our live broadcast. We appreciate that. But she says that she'd love to go to a 4-day school week. And that's actually already happened in one local school district.
Right. The Middleton School District made that decision a couple of weeks ago. And to my knowledge, and I've written about 4-day schools quite a bit over the past few years, Middleton.
Wait, let me pause you right there. Wait, hang on. You haven't just written about it. I have to pause you because you haven't just written about it, Kevin. You have award-winning work out on this because of the in-depth research that you've done. So if people want to go to idahoednews.org and really read about 4-day school weeks and whether or not they work and how they work for different school districts all across the state of Idaho, that's where you can find it. Okay, go on, my friend. I just had to put that little plug in.
That's a series I did about 5 years ago now, looking at 4-day schools around the state. And that's already a project that is on our radar. That maybe 5 years later, we need to take a second look at 4-day schools. So that's kind of on our long-term docket of things to do when we have nothing else to do, because 4-day schools are a growing trend in Idaho. As you mentioned, Middleton made the move to a 4-day school district, to a 4-day calendar starting in the fall. Blackfoot in eastern Idaho did this as well. These are the two largest districts to my research. These will be the two largest districts in the state to go to a 4-day calendar. It had been in the past very small districts to a large degree, rural districts to a large degree. Now, Middleton, Blackfoot, these are not as, these are larger districts. They're kind of mid-sized school districts. So something we will definitely be wanting to watch more closely.
Well, and especially as we move forward with what online learning could look like for the fall, or rolling online learning. I mean, just as a parent myself, if you want a little glimpse into my life, we're not supposed to officially end remote learning until June 2nd in the West Ada District. I can pretty much promise you that we will be ending it in my house earlier than next week.
Well, everybody's having to adjust, right? Everybody's having to react.
Okay, in case you haven't joined us for Making the Grade, and this becomes the silly section because, we just have to do it this way, is that Kevin has an incredible sock collection. Has nothing to do with education, unless you want to grab your kids and bring them to the screen right now, because this is the fun part where I make Kevin try and show me what socks he's wearing for the day.
Okay.
Up in front of him.
Kind of show these off. So the story behind these is that journalists often say that we try to never read the comments because sometimes the comments are sometimes the comments on our stories are a little bit off color. But one commenter once referred to me as it's like I say, it's one of my favorite comments of all time. Referred to me as a quote unquote corporate penguin heart. Whatever that means, I loved it. Corporate penguin heart. So whenever I wear these socks, I think of that commenter because they're little penguins.
A corporate penguin heart?
Yeah. Right. Ow. Yeah. So yes. I don't know what that means, except that doesn't sound very warm or friendly. So yes, corporate penguin heart.
I don't know. You could look good in a tux with a red tie. I'm going to give them that.
They're very versatile. These socks. They can go to a lot of different places.
Kevin,
and it's going to be 98 degrees this weekend. It's perfect penguin weather. Not really.
Right. No. Yeah.
No.
We're going to send you back to school, my friend.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Oh, everybody, thank you so much for joining us for this live broadcast of Making the Grade. Kevin, thank you for playing my penguin games, as I will now refer to them, with your socks.
Anytime.
And we will be following closely as idahoednews.org continues to do the amazing writing that they do for all of us in the education world and trying to cover the education world in these unprecedented times.
Yes.
If you would like to continue to comment, Kevin and I do like to read your comments, even if they're
a little... read your comments. You can call me whatever you want in the comments too. I've heard it all.
Well, penguin, my friend, there you go. And of course, Idaho News 6 will continue to bring you the latest education stories every single night as we broadcast at 5, 6, and 10. Kevin, enjoy your day and your penguin socks. We'll see you next week for Making the Grade.
Have a good week.